Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helfer Parker, and today my guest is Holly Welker. She is the editor of a new book called Bearing Witness, 36 Mormon Women Talk Candidly About Love, Sex, and Marriage, out of the University of Illinois Press, and she's also the co-editor of Singing and Dancing to the Book of Mormon, Critical Essays on the Broadway Musical, published earlier this year by Rowman and Littlefield. You've been busy. And
Yes.
She has a PhD in literature from the University of Iowa, and her writings on Mormonism have appeared in many publications, such as Best American Essays, Bitch, Slate, and the New York Times, and currently lives in Mesa, Arizona. Welcome to the program, Holly.
Thanks for having me on.
Why don't we just dive right in as far as telling us a little bit about this project, Bearing Witness, and what led to its creation?
Well, the first thing, I'm going to start a long way in the past with something that actually might be relevant to some of your listeners in a broader sense, more generally. So I have, as I mentioned, I have a PhD in literature, and within that degree, my emphasis is on contemporary American literary nonfiction, more specifically essay, memoir, autobiography. And one of my teachers in my PhD program was a woman named Patricia Foster, and in 1994, she published a book called Minding the Body, that was a collection of essays by women about their bodies and how they felt about their bodies. And it was a beautiful book, and I really enjoyed it. And that was just something people did in my discipline. They put together personal essays on a particular topic, and people found it meaningful. It's something they bought. It's something they liked. Around 2000, I forget the exact date of the publication, one of my friends from another degree program, I have an MFA in poetry from the University of Arizona, and while I was there, I became friends with a woman named Kathy Hanauer, who would eventually put together a collection of essays called The Bitch in the House, that was 26, 27 women writing about their feelings about motherhood, marriage, sex, and so forth. And her husband, Dan Jones, eventually did a companion volume called The Bastard on the Couch. 27 men try really hard to figure out their feelings about all these things. So in 2010, my mother died 6 months before my parents' 50th anniversary, and it was a very painful death. She had liver disease. She was a good Mormon woman who never had a drink in her life, but she had Crohn's disease and some other things that caused scarring in her liver, and it was a very hard death, and the timing was terrible. And one thing that happened after she died was that I realized, at least, how much I didn't understand about my parents' marriage. My parents had a fraught but stable marriage. My father would be unhappy to know that I had said that in public. He does not have a mean bone in his body, but he is a difficult person to deal with in many ways. And after my mother died, I realized very forcefully how much she had sacrificed in her marriage. And my mother was a force of nature. as I say in the introduction to the collection, she was born with an extra vertebrae, which means she literally had a lot of backbone. And I just became really curious about what her life had been like. And I started reading books, memoirs about Mormon marriage. And I couldn't find that many. I found a few. I found Phyllis Barber's work, for instance. There were mentions here and there in other books. I started asking my friends really snoopy questions about their marriage. And at some point I just went, oh, wait a minute. I already have this model where people who, like me, are interested in memoir, personal essay, ask a whole bunch of people to write on a topic. So why don't I just ask several dozen of my friends to write about their marriages or their divorces or their failure to marry and see what I get? And so I set out to do it. It took me 6 years. It was a labor of love. It was really interesting. I learned a lot. And that's the book.
How did you go about finding the particular stories that would be included? Like, how did you even advertise, or did you ask certain people that you knew?
At first, I just asked my friends. Then I went to some of the major blogs directed at Mormon women, issued a call for papers, call for submissions, asked friends of friends. At the point at which I could say that I had an essay from both Joanna Brooks and Stephanie Lauritsen, other people finally started to pay attention. Up until that point, it took me a long time. People were leery. They were very wary of telling their secrets, and they were concerned about how they would look. It was extremely important to me to showcase every essay in a way that made its author proud. I wanted the entire collection to be something that people were proud to be part of, and I wanted people to look at their essays and want to show them off. But it sometimes takes a while to convince people of that. And there was also the fact that I wanted this book to cover a lot of different elements. For instance, it contains 2 essays about lesbian relationships, and some contributors, some devout contributors, became alarmed when they found out that there would be sympathetic discussions of same-sex relationships and loss of faith, and pulled their essays, which skewed the content. More of the contributors have a somewhat fraught relationship with the church. That wasn't something I wanted. In fact, that was something I didn't want, but that's how it shook out.
So just the uncomfortableness of some of the members with the other stories that would be included,
right?
Made the final product less, I guess, spectrumed.
Yes. People who originally were willing to write about something, once they found out that they might be in a collection with somebody talking about being married to a woman, said, oh, no, that's not the venue for me. So,
okay. What would you say was your purpose in trying to get this book out there?
There's a very famous statement by Toni Morrison that I'll paraphrase, since I don't think I can quote it verbatim. If there's a book out there that you want to read and it hasn't been written yet, then you have to write it. Or in my case, I had to solicit the essays, edit them, and curate them and arrange them. So one of my goals was to bring into existence the book that I wanted to read after my mother's death. Another was simply that I realized that this was a gap in the conversation and I could fill it. It became interesting to me as I started thinking about it that there were many essay collections by Mormon women about motherhood, but I couldn't find one about marriage. And even in the initial stages of putting this book together, when I would say, tell me about your marriage, women would start writing about motherhood. And I realized that those things often go hand in hand, but they don't always go hand in hand. And there are significant differences between them. And I told some women, no, I don't want to hear so much about your children. And they couldn't do it. They couldn't tease out what was simply their marriage. Marriage is so central to Mormon theology and Mormon culture, but there are ways in which we don't have very good conventions for talking about it. I did not articulate this until very far along in the process, but the question I was interested in was this. Given that a particular emphasis on marriage is one of the things distinguishing the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, what distinguishes LDS marriages for the women in them? And I think the answer to that question remains to be seen. I have 36 essays that offer an answer. It is by no means definitive. University of Illinois Press, they were so great. They were so wonderful. They have long been a leader in Mormon studies, and I knew as soon as I started working with the editor, her name's Dawn Durante, that I'd found the right home for the collection. They really wanted to make it indispensable to conversations about Mormon literature and Mormon marriage, and something can be indispensable to a conversation without being the last word. So I am really hoping that other people will deepen and broaden and further the conversation. For instance, I was unable to get very many essays that deal with race. Gina Colvin is a contributor. She's Maori. She writes a lot about critical race theory, and yet race is not mentioned in her essay because, as she told me, it wasn't relevant. A couple of the contributors, Naomi Watkins, wrote about being single. She is now trying to put together a collection of essays on being Mormon and single. She has a contract with Greg Coford Books, so if you have a story to tell about that, look her up on Facebook, Naomi Watkins. Mary Ellen Robertson is working on a collection about Mormons and divorce. So I've been really happy with the way it has piqued other people's curiosity and interest. And for that matter, the press has already asked me to do a companion volume of essays by Mormon men about marriage, and I have begun work on that. So if you have a story, if you are a Mormon man and you have something to say about Mormon marriage, divorce, singlehood, sexuality, anything that relates to the way we talk about this broad umbrella of marriage, shoot me a message.
And are you comfortable with me asking, what was it about your parents' marriage that drew you to this topic to begin with?
As I mentioned, my mother was a force of nature, and she told us once that she could remember the names of a dozen of the men who proposed to her, and that there were plenty others she had forgotten. I just don't quite know why she chose my dad. I love my father, and as I mentioned, he is not cruel, and yet he has this sort of oblivious selfishness that I think is partly due to the fact that he is of a particular generation. He was born in the 30s. He was also lost his mother when he was 3 years old and was raised by elderly grandparents because his father had a job that required traveling, and you did not give up even a bad job in 1936 when my grandmother died. One of the stories that I learned from infancy was about how my father received a witness from the Holy Ghost that he was going to marry my mother. He got this witness before they'd even been on a date. And in fact, they were decorating for a dance at the Tucson Institute, and my mother was unhappy with the way my father was putting up decorations and told him this in no uncertain terms. And he was driving home thinking about how she was kind of mean, and he had to pull over because he heard a voice tell him, "You're going to marry that girl." Not "you are," but "you're." For some reason, it was extremely important to him that the Holy Ghost spoke to him in contractions, which it did on several occasions. And when she died, I began thinking about whether or not her life had been happy and whether or not she had been satisfied. And she died, I think, fairly young. She was 72, which is young these days. I miss her. And I just started wondering about the disparity between what she expected for her marriage and what she actually got, and why we had a foundational family myth about it that seemed to take my mother's agency out of it in some ways. Dad knew long before it was even a remote possibility that they would marry. In fact, when he proposed, she was engaged to someone else. And yet there they were. And, I'm not sorry they married, because it produced me, of course, and my 5 siblings. I just don't quite know why she chose him. And I will tell you another story, which was that one of my cousins once was in an institute class, and the teacher of the institute class, it was a class on marriage and family preparation for marriage, something like that, preparation for a temple marriage. And the teacher started talking about this couple in a town where he had lived for many years, that they were just this odd couple. He was quiet, she was very dynamic. It was sort of hard to see what brought them together, what kept them together. And my cousin went up to him afterwards and said, "Oh, you know my Aunt Marilyn and her husband." And he laughed and said, "Oh, I didn't think anybody would be aware of the Welkers from Thatcher, Arizona," but my cousin was. It was an odd marriage, and I could no longer ask my mother questions about her life, so I wanted to look at issues around her life through lenses that were available to me, and other people's experiences were one such lens.
Was she the type of mother that would confide to you
No.
concerns about her marriage? No. Okay.
She did not confide. She did not. Oh, every now and then she'd say something. But my mother was very much stiff upper lip sort of person. That extra vertebrae that she was born with actually caused her pain every day of her life. My mom was tough. One of the old security questions was always, "What is your mother's maiden name?" And I never used it because my grandfather was actually a little bit of a celebrity. He was a champion rodeo participant. His name was OK Post, and my mother's maiden name was Post, and it fit her. She was this upright, strong support. So no, she did not confide to us, and it was partly her absence that allowed us to see how much we had not realized about just how many accommodations she had to make as part of her daily life.
So the intersection between sexuality and marriage is obviously inseparable in Mormonism. And
yeah.
Did you get a sense from your parents and living with them what their sexuality might have been like? Was that at all something that you would think about?
Yes, but I'm not willing to discuss it here. So out of respect to them, they are both very private people. And while I would talk about some of the broader issues that people might have noticed, I'm not going to discuss something that I know they felt was deeply intimate and deeply personal. they'd be really mad at me if I said it.
Sure. No, that's completely understandable.
Yeah.
And that goes to a lot of, I think, how I guess through the lens of Mormonism, how we do see sexuality as something very personal, very sacred, something that you really only speak of between married partners oftentimes, especially like you're saying in older generations. So then this kind of gets us into the mode of talking about what are the messages that we receive in Mormonism about marriage, about sexuality, the expectations we might go into a marriage thinking about, and then how life unfolds. And so I'd love to hear from you some of the messages that you were able to glean from the many essays that you compiled into this book, and some of the themes that you think would be important to bring up on a podcast like this where we do focus on Mormon sexuality.
Right. Part of what happened was that through the process, people told me things that they then said, okay, wait, I'm not comfortable sharing that. And I said, okay, that's fine. But I would like to give a big shout out to Britton Goodsell, who wrote a very candid essay about sex. The title of it is called My Next Scene. And her essay is about, it's the most clearly and explicitly about sex. It's about the fact that she had this boyfriend in college and they managed to stay chaste enough to be married in the temple, and yet they were pretty darn close to failing that temple recommend. They pushed every boundary they could and still get a temple recommend.
Right.
And she talks about the fact that she frequently orgasmed during their makeout sessions before they got married. And then once they got married, there were a few things that happened. One, she went on the pill, and it killed her libido. And two, she had a sister who nearly died from a complicated pregnancy and had decided herself that she maybe didn't want kids, probably didn't want kids, so she was very afraid of getting pregnant. And then they were in grad school, and sex was not good. She said she was absolutely shocked that foreplay could be so fabulous and the actual sex could be so terrible. And what happened was that her husband had an affair, and the combination of all these things destroyed the marriage. She really went through a lot. For instance, she saw a therapist who actually did very painful physical therapy involving her vagina and stretching it out.
Like a pelvic floor therapist?
Yes, I think, yeah. It's a remarkable essay. The good news is that she has gone on to have an extremely happy sex life, but heavens, did she go through a lot to get there. There were some other people who discussed sex in some interesting ways. There's an essay by a woman whose husband was gay, and he was her first and only boyfriend. And she writes about discovering, realizing after he came out of the closet to her that sexual orientation has simultaneously nothing to do with sex and everything to do with sex. And that it's just not going to work. The expectations so many Mormons have that sex is not that important to a marriage. What matters most is companionship, loving the Lord, being righteous, that it's often not the case, that a frustrating, disappointing sex life really can be enough to ensure that a marriage cannot succeed.
Those are two stories that right there's a lot we could talk about, and just expectations going into a marriage, fear of pregnancy, and how sexuality oftentimes in religious marriages is very much tied to having a family and children. Also, what happens to libido before and after marriage and all the complexities of that, and painful sex, which I don't know, the first story you talked about, if she was going to appropriate pelvic floor exercise therapy or if there was something inappropriate happening there. And I'm not exactly sure the context of that.
She said there wasn't, that it was a fairly vanilla marriage. There was nothing that would seem unusual to most people. It was more, wow, I'm actually not very used to talking this candidly about sex. I would say it was more lack of arousal, that it felt like sandpaper. Penetration felt like burning in sandpaper, and having something just too big go in something clinically too small. That's
Okay. Yeah. So some type of vaginismus issue
yeah,
or something along
yeah,
those lines
yeah,
that then she was
yeah,
trying to get treatment for.
yeah.
Was the treatment traumatic for her or was it helpful?
It was helpful, but the thing is that she never got to test it out because she and her husband never again had sex after she learned about the infidelity.
And I'm assuming that you're inferring that part of the infidelity was possibly due to the fact that they were not satisfied sexually in their
Right.
relationship.
Yes. And I'm not inferring that. She acknowledges that he went outside of the marriage for sex since he couldn't get it in the marriage.
I see.
And
so a lot of painful things there
right,
for both of them.
right,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
yes,
Yeah, and then of course mixed orientation marriages, which we see oftentimes in religious cultures as well, because there's not necessarily the freedom for those who are LGBT to be worthy and righteous and marry according to their orientation, obviously.
yes.
So those kinds of issues for sure come up as well. So what would you like to say as far as having compiled these stories, listened, I'm sure, to many women as you compiled the stories? What would you say are some of the positives or negatives that would come out of these experiences that make this whole Mormon marriage thing either worthwhile or a disaster or a combination of both?
Well, one of the things that I really was struck by, and this is also influenced partly by the fact that I moved to Utah in 2008, and so was there during the efforts to pass Proposition 8. I lived just a few blocks from the temple in Salt Lake City and had been a long time supporter of LGBTQ rights. I went to my first gay marriage in 1993. I didn't even know it could be done until one of my really good friends from kindergarten invited me to his wedding. And I was like, wait a minute, you can get married? And he said, well, it's not legal, but yeah, we're going to have a commitment ceremony. I grew up in southern Arizona, and I certainly saw a variety of marriages. I mean, one thing I guess I should mention is that I myself am single. Perhaps that has not registered, but I'm single and don't really care about that very much. There's a lot of ways in which the culture probably doesn't believe me, but of all the things that I feel sorry for myself for, being single is not even in the top 50. And when I got to Utah, it just seemed like marriage there was skewed, that it was a little bit weird. I have a family member that I think has just a beautifully sweet marriage. If I had to name a happy marriage, I would name this marriage of a very close relative. My grandparents, my mother's parents, had a very devoted marriage. They adored each other, but it just was a little bit weird in Utah. And I started thinking in ways I hadn't quite before as I watched some of my friends, frankly, struggle to stay in marriages for eternity that most people wouldn't want to stay in for another month, about just how much pressure Mormons put on marriage. I quote a passage in the introduction from Stephanie Kuntz's book, Marriage: A History, and this is it. The historical transformation in marriage over the ages has created a similar paradox for society as a whole. Marriage has become more joyful, more loving, and more satisfying for many couples than ever before in history. At the same time, it has become optional and more brittle. These two strands cannot be disentangled, end quote. And then I am now quoting myself from my introduction. The catch for Latter-day Saints is that while marriage has grown more brittle, so much in the church is aimed at cementing it, not just until death parts a couple, but for all eternity. Certainly, Mormons blessed with loving, successful marriages often feel enriched and inspired by the promise that their marriage may last forever. But things can be very different for couples in unhappy or difficult marriages. In the words of one church president, and this is Spencer Kimball, without proper and successful marriage, one will never be exalted. End quote. Informing couples that marriage will provide them not only earthly joy, but also eternal salvation and exaltation if they do it right, but will consign them to eternal inferiority if they do it wrong, may or may not make marriage more brittle, but it certainly increases the pressure on troubled marriages and the people in them.
And how many of the women who wrote these excerpts would you say came from troubled versus more positive relationships?
Most of them. And that's partly a function of good storytelling. Good storytelling requires conflict. So most of the essays deal with trouble. This was something that, quite frankly, troubled me. And I really wanted to have at least one essay that depicted a consistently happy marriage. And so I asked people in happy marriages who self-identified as being in a happy marriage if they would write an essay for me. And I got two responses. One, they said, oh, it would just be too boring. There's nothing to tell. Or they would also say, I wouldn't know what to tell anybody. I just got lucky. The catch, of course, is that Mormons aren't supposed to get lucky in terms of finding a spouse. They're supposed to be rewarded for righteous living. They're supposed to prayerfully search for a companion. We're also told that happiness in marriage is more a matter of being the right person than marrying the right person. So the idea that luck plays a significant role in happiness in Mormon marriages is frankly a radical idea. I did find one person who was willing to write about that. It was Rachel Whipple, and I was really grateful to her. And even when I went to my editor at the press and said, these are the array of essays, she said, well, this one right here, this one by Rachel Whipple about, it's just, there's not much conflict. And I'm like, that's the point. I would never want anyone to think that this collection is an utterly representative sample of all Mormon marriages. It is 36 largely white, native English speakers, educated women writing about what has and has not made them happy in their marriages. There is a section on divorce and on second chances. Well, there's a section, first of all, on divorce and other endings. There's only one essay about widowhood. I really wanted more, but I had to take what was available, what people submitted at some point. And then there's a section on second chances, which is about second marriages that are happy after a somewhat disastrous first marriage.
I wonder how many people do you feel included sexuality as part of their Mormon marriage story?
There were quite a few women who mentioned it in a somewhat offhand way. For instance, the very first essay is by Heather K. Olson Beale, and it is about her husband's faith crisis and how that influenced their marriage. And there's one place where she mentions sex a couple of times. She creates a spreadsheet as she's trying to deal with his faith crisis and the way it impacts her and their marriage and even her children. She makes a spreadsheet and lists how many times they have sex, and there were not very many times. She also thinks that in order to repair the marriage, she should go with Dr. Laura's advice that men only want sex or a sandwich. And she tried the sex first, and he wasn't interested, which was a big red flag. There's an essay by a woman named Tiffany Moss, and she discusses her wedding night. And the fact that after she lost her virginity, she locked herself in the bathroom and cried for the rest of the night, which, kudos to her husband who read the essay and knew she was publishing it and has also agreed to tell his side of the story for the companion volume of essays by men.
So meaning she had put so much of her own personal value on her sexual purity and virginity that marriage was very difficult for her to face that?
I think it's more just something that is so common to people the first time. The sex is not very good. They had a very short courtship, very short engagement. They didn't know each other. She actually proposed to her husband while they were missionaries.
So the expectations, I guess, of
Right.
of what a wedding night might entail,
Right.
and not having that happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Do you get a sense that women felt that their sexual experiences or needs were important, that they were valid and legitimate?
For many of them, yes. And yeah, for many of them, absolutely. And having a partner who agreed was a source of real happiness and satisfaction.
So the quality of the emotional relationship as well.
Right. And the way that could help make sex more enjoyable, safer, a more reliably strong part of the marriage.
It's fascinating when either women or men are willing to share. And you're naming names, so I'm guessing these were not anonymous essays. These are essays where names are attached and people are putting their stories out there in very vulnerable and open ways.
There were, I would say, about half a dozen or so. There are 36 essays in the collection, and there were somewhere between, say, 6 and 12. I haven't counted exactly. Women who chose to use a pseudonym. Quite a few women published under their maiden name rather than their married name. Every essay has an author's name, but for instance, one of the author's names is Christmas Jones. Actually, that's a really interesting essay because it's about being 29 and single and trying to figure out how sex comes into play in all of this. The fact that she didn't really mind facing the prospect of never marrying. Her parents had an absolutely miserable marriage, and their divorce was one of the best things that ever happened to their family. But she calls sex not just the elephant in the room, but the asshole babar, waving its trunk. You didn't forget about me, did you? Once you reach a certain age and you haven't lost your virginity in the outside world, that's weird. And no one really wants to be the one to deflower a 30-something Mormon virgin.
Mm. And how that impacted maybe her dating life or her
Right.
sense of self.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. What about the lesbian story that you mentioned earlier?
There are two. One is about a lesbian divorce. Not that they were legally married, but about the breakup of a lesbian relationship. It was partly about how that their emphasis on family and the importance of family in terms of family of origin led them to devalue the family they were as a couple. And the other is about two women who were best friends beginning in their 20s. They met in their 20s and were both in straight marriages, both had children, and spent a lot of time, basically dated, but just were too afraid of what it would mean to their families, their lives, their careers. They both worked, I think they were both nurses, or at least worked in doctor's offices. They didn't come out of the closet even really to themselves until one of them got cancer and decided she wasn't going to live her life anyway, but as authentically as she could. Her name is Lynn Burnett. again, she signed her essay. Her partner's name is Janet. She went to Janet and said, I want to do this. And Janet said, no, 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 no. So a decade or so passed, and then they both found each other and they got married. And she said they feel like the luckiest girls in the world, feel like they have a slumber party every night. And there's even a photo of them in the collection, taken at Pride in Provo a couple of years ago. And they would have gotten married, I'm guessing, in their 50s. And they did get married. They went to Canada before it was legal in the U.S. and got married.
Hmm. And do those particular essays talk at all about the intersection of their faith journey and how that was?
Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm. That especially Prop 8 was important. They were both out by then. And they still live in Utah County. So it's a bit of a struggle, but they feel very lucky. Children and grandchildren have, by and large, and even neighbors have been pretty accepting of them. The role of faith and a loss of faith or questioning faith is important in quite a few of the essays. And it does relate to sex. It's hard to want to sleep with someone who you feel has betrayed you in a fundamental way, and losing one's faith, changing the terms under which the marriage was contracted, feels like a big betrayal.
Right. Yeah, that's a very difficult situation to be in because it's not like people necessarily choose to have that happen, and yet those feelings of betrayal are very real. Well, as you were compiling and putting these together, how did it fit with the goal for you to understand the things that you had hoped to understand going into the project to begin with?
I do feel that I understand some of the things about my mother better. I also feel like I understand some of my friends better. I also feel even better than I did before about being single. And it's curiosity is a wonderful thing, and being curious about other people's lives made me curious about my own and curious about questions I had not asked. It reaffirmed my feminism in many ways, but it also made me realize that I did need to do more reading in terms of masculinity studies. I have been collecting titles for that, but haven't really gotten very far into reading them. That's part of what I'll have to do in order to curate the essays I'm collecting and write an introduction. You never learn exactly the things you expect to learn, because if you did, that meant you already knew it, and you were basically just revising or brushing up on something. So there were a lot of things that surprised me.
Could you speak to some of that?
Well, again, just how much was on the line, just how much would be at stake in the dissolution of a Mormon marriage, which, of course, I knew that in some ways. I knew I'd sat through enough conference talks on how to have a happy marriage and how you shouldn't get divorced, but the extent to which the many, many, many things women would try to do. There's a statement, something about no one should get a divorce, as if marriage were this convenience to be abandoned at the first sign of difficulty. I mean, there are so many just pop songs talking about how breaking up is hard to do. The reasons why people stay together can be ridiculous. They've already bought their outfits for the prom. And so even though they know they don't like each other, they'll stay together for another month so they can go to the prom together. Or I remember in one case, I was thinking about breaking up with a boyfriend, but I'd already bought his Christmas present. So I was like, well, I'll just stay with him, whatever. Just how much women are willing to do to keep an unhappy marriage intact for all sorts of reasons that seem really sound and completely understandable. It's one of the things it really did is sensitize me even more to the question of, why do you stay? Well, people stay because they're not ready to leave. And I realize that in many ways that's a facile answer, but it's also the truest one. It takes so much courage and work and willpower to leave something you've invested in for decades. And especially when there are children involved, I am just going to work really hard not to be at all judgy when someone stays in a marriage that looks unhappy to me, and to assume that when they do leave, they have a darn good reason for it.
And do you get any pushback being single yourself as far as why you would have edited a book on marriage?
I think I would have gotten a lot more pushback if I presumed to give advice, but I guess you could say that I'm kind of an anthropologist of marriage. I'm offering people no suggestions on how to have a happy marriage. So, I mean, yes, people do think it's a little bit weird. I just say, well, one of my standard answers is nobody wrote more novels about marriage than Jane Austen, and she was a spinster too.
That's right. A spinster.
She and I have the same birthday, so
Right.
I even say that in the introduction, like Jane Austen, whose birthday I share. I am a spinster who is very interested in marriage.
Right. So I'm going to ask this question in kind of two parts. What would you hope that Mormons get out of reading this book? And then possibly what would you hope for non-Mormons, so people who are interested in Mormonism but don't really have the cultural background, to get from this book?
One, I would hope that Mormons get a sense of just how many people are out there writing interesting literature. I started my writing life as a poet, and I really cared about the quality of the writing, and we worked very hard to make them beautiful and rewarding simply as literature. Another thing I would hope they would get is a little more curiosity and compassion, and also a little more courage to tell their own stories if it doesn't fit the norm, or even if it does. These people who kept saying to me, my story is too boring. Well, I really wanted to hear it anyway. I really did. I mentioned her before, Rachel. Thank you again for telling me your story about a happy marriage. I think the vocabulary in terms of how to talk about Mormon marriage was always there, but there weren't certain templates or patterns. There wasn't a syntax. And I say that because there's an essay in the book called The Language of Marriage about how every marriage creates a new language. So just a little more ease and comfort in talking about marriage. It's interesting, on Goodreads, there are 2 reviews by women who are clearly LDS who are complaining that the book is full of essays by women who felt that the church was somehow to blame for their ideas about marriage. Well, yes, that's part of the point. Yeah,
we talk a lot about it.
Yes, yes.
We create a narrative around marriage.
Right. And so for people out of the church, what I would hope they would get is more awareness of just how crucial marriage is to Mormons. It certainly helps explain, for instance, the Prop 8 campaign, if you understand that Mormonism relies on marriage for its view of both the heavenly and earthly ideal, that it's the nuclear family. I would hope that they also would get a sense of Mormon complexity, that despite the fact that Mormons do emphasize this kind of 1950s father knows best marriage, women still have a lot of individuality and complexity and awareness as they try to craft a happy marriage, that it's not just a bunch of subservient women doing whatever their husband says. There's not one single essay like that in the book.
Well, and a caricature of Mormon women that I think, rightly so, we fight a lot against.
Yeah. A lot more evidence that that caricature is a caricature. And the book is designed to be accessible to a non-Mormon audience. It's actually designed to be useful in several settings. It has a scholarly introduction and it has a glossary at the end. And my hope was that it might be an appropriate course selection in classes on women's studies, religion, sociology, marriage and family therapy. And I also would hope that people in your profession, Natasha, would find it valuable as a resource, that there might be couples who come in who have questions and that you could say, well, you know, your story is not really all that strange and bizarre. You can look at this book. This book will give you some frame of reference for women who have faced similar challenges. You're not alone.
It's really important in therapy settings to have some cultural competence around whether it's race, ethnicity, religious culture, that clients are coming in with. And that's hard to do when you have a wide variety of clients. So any resources in that regard, I think, are really helpful.
Yes, one of the essays mentions going as a couple to a therapist who just found bits of Mormonism so strange. And I think probably that's something a lot of people, even if they've done individual therapy, going to talk to somebody about issues related to the church and having the therapist just get really confused and spending as much time bringing them up to speed as having them actually offer you advice and resources that can help you deal with what you're facing.
That's exactly right. And that's where I bring up a lot of times the goal of the Mormon Mental Health Association that I'm a part of is to increase cultural competence.
Yes.
Because I get the complaints both ways. Either I went to the Mormon therapist who was too Mormon and didn't allow my own Mormon journey, or I went to the non-Mormon therapist who basically I just spent a lot of time educating them on Mormonism.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yes. I have had both problems myself. Yes.
Well, it's interesting. I liked the comment that you made about the publisher looking at your essays and going, this one isn't, conflictual enough. And how that speaks to a lot of the processes just from us as consumers, that we want conflict or drama, to entertain us in a sense. And how that's tragic in some ways, because I think that there are many wonderful, positive stories. The Mormon paradigm and the messaging within Mormonism around marriage and even sexuality oftentimes is very helpful or useful. It's sad when we get into this either or scenarios. It's either all bad or it's all good. And I hope, if anything, the work that I'm involved with hopefully complicates things a little bit more than that. There can be good and bad in every marriage, that there can be good and bad and sexual messaging that we get from our religious cultures. It seems like this book really speaks to that spectrum, even though it's unfortunate that you lost some of the more orthodox stories in the process. What would you say as far as that idea of conflict versus positivity, and then maybe getting to the fact that there's probably some stories in your book that are so conflictual that you probably start entering the realm of abuse?
There is one essay that is very much about an abusive marriage. This is one of the essays that has a pseudonym. The author goes by Viv B, just the initial B. But even there, one of the things that was interesting to me was that she was very careful to say much of what you said, that it wasn't all one way or the other. In fact, I'm going to read a short passage here. Quote, I can't help feeling a little guilty that I'm presenting a skewed portrait of my marriage. George wasn't all bad. I married him and bore his children because I loved him, and despite all the ways he hurt me, I continued to love him in ways that mattered very much to me. If there hadn't been something to redeem the marriage, I would have left ages ago. For 29 years, there was enough good in the marriage that I could justify putting up with someone who beat me, abused me, told me I was worthless. And then, one day, there wasn't. End quote.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. She leaves him on Valentine's Day. And the essay is called The Last Valentine's Day. And yes, he did. He beat the crap out of her. And since we're talking about sex, there's a euphemism for sex I had never quite heard before. I'll read one more paragraph from this. Taking his cue from an article in a church magazine titled Fidelity in Marriage, It's More Than You Think, George became distraught over any friendship I cultivated with anyone but him. One evening, he was driven to blows by his frustration over an online conversation I'd had with a man. One of our daughters came in the bedroom, worried by the noise she was hearing. She saw me curled into survival position, George hitting me repeatedly with a clenched fist on the back and side of my head. Dad, stop it, she pleaded. He stormed from the room. For hours, he recited his litany of grievances to the grown children gathered downstairs, while I lay upstairs, silent and still, staring at my downy blue striped coverlet. In the small hours of the morning, he crept into bed, and we clung to each other in the marital embrace. End quote. And then she gets up the next morning and she leaves him. Aside from that, I guess I should also say there are two essays by women who divorced between the time they wrote the essay and the time the book was published. One of them, the divorce, she knew it was coming early enough that she actually added a postscript about the fact that your sense of your marriage and where it's headed can change very drastically, very rapidly. And the other didn't. I still feel quite jarred every time I think about it.
Meaning the unexpectability of the divorce?
Yeah, yeah. And a little unsure how to talk to her about it. You know, here I am so happy about the birth of this book and its entrance into the world, and there is this strange story, this snapshot of her life with a projected future that didn't turn out. And I can't say I feel guilty, but I feel odd that I have a part in that. So.
Right. Well, and you read the excerpt from the woman who was being physically abused. That is such an interesting interplay that passion and violence and sexuality oftentimes intersect in such interesting and dramatic and harmful ways in people's lives. Yeah. That's a whole nother podcast, I guess, that I can speak to, but just really interesting that you would have brought that theme up for sure.
Well, and that she was willing to write about it. You know, I mean, there were a number of things. For instance, one of the essays, I'll just go ahead and mention this without saying anything that would alert anyone to which one it might be, but one of the essays, one of the issues going on in the marriage is that the husband is a transvestite and really enjoys wearing women's clothes, and she and her wife, they have a straight marriage, but this persona, she loves to get dressed up, have her nails done, and play cards. And her wife does that and does that happily. And it is actually a surprisingly small part of what makes the marriage complicated. There are other issues that are far more dramatic. This woman didn't want to write about it in this context, and that was perfectly fine. I know that the husband, in his female persona, I know she is out to some extent, but they didn't want it discussed here, and that was perfectly fine. I feel like it really is sort of like a photograph, and you don't have to agree to let somebody publish a completely unflattering photograph of you. You know, you get to say, I don't really like that one. Can we maybe go with this one? And do you think maybe we could Photoshop that zit on my nose out of it? I was perfectly fine with that. I still wanted to tell something that was recognizable as the truth, and I'm making air quotes as I say that, but I did not feel any obligation to try to tell the whole truth. The limit was 5,000 words, and there's only so much you can say about a marriage in 5,000 words.
For sure. So tell us a little bit more about where we can find the book.
It's on Amazon. Right now, it's selling for about, the Kindle is about $16, and the paperback is about $17. The cloth bound is $95. I doubt very many people will buy that, but the occasional library might. I'm a big supporter of public libraries. I love the public library. If you don't want to buy a copy yourself, ask your public library to buy a copy. There's almost on pretty much every library website, there's a spot where you can request that they buy a title. I'm hoping it's also going to be in brick and mortar stores. That's one of the things I have to get working on is going to some of my local brick and mortar stores and asking them to carry it. I know that it's going to be in 2 bookstores in Utah, the King's English in Salt Lake City and Writ and Vision in Provo. And I and some of the contributors will be doing readings Wednesday, September 22nd at the King's English and Thursday, September 23rd at Writ and Vision. Please come if you're in the area. Please consider buying a book from the local independent bookseller. Have to make a plug for them. And, I really hope that this is the beginning of a new direction in the conversation about marriage, and that many responses are being created even as we speak.
Anything you'd want to say to the contributors who gave their essays to this project as your closing thoughts?
Thank you again. Thank you for your generosity, for your eloquence, your courage. And I love your stories. I read them dozens of times. I never ceased to be edified. I would also like to thank a little over a dozen women whose stories, for one reason or another, did not get included in the book. That was actually really hard. It ended a friendship or two where I had an essay I liked and my editor said this book is just too long. In particular, the issue of faithfulness to the church. For instance, there were 2 essays about women who chafed under the church's emphasis on homemaking in their marriage. One woman, as part of that, left the church, and the other woman rededicated herself to the church. Because there was so little from faithful women, my editor said, we've got to pick this one. We've got to pick this one where the woman rededicates herself to the church. And that meant I had to write a terribly painful email to this other person and say, I'm so sorry, I can't include your essay. It was awful for both of us. But those stories are out there. They are already being written. They are already being told. And I'm hoping that some of the magazines and blogs and websites that are out there will want to hear more about it, and that the conversation will continue.
Wonderful. Thank you, Holly. I really appreciate your time on our show today.
I had a great time. Thank you so much for giving me a chance to talk about this.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary extraordinary truth.
It's been a long road here, a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary. It's nothing hard.